Beethoven wrote 32 of these little suckers, starting in its very early career. And in fact, the first two sonatas are Opus 2. If you know what Opus numbers is, a way of cataloging the composer's works. So, and they're numbered normally from the earliest to the latest. So Opus 2 obviously are very early. The one that I played last week, the Waldstein, or 2 weeks ago, is Opus 56, I think. So there are 3 periods of sonatas. There's the early sonatas, which is about, I think 11 of them, and then there's like 15 or so in the middle, and 5 at the end, 5 or 6 at the end. 5 at the end, and 15 or 6, 17 in the middle. Anyway, there are 32 sonatas, and he has 3 periods. And what's interesting about these sonatas is that they, in a sense, were the first really important set of a whole cycle of works of a kind. In fact, Hans von Bülow, a very famous pianist and composer, called them the New Testament of music. And the most important work at that time that had been the collection of work that had been done. He said the Old Testament was the Bach Well-tempered clavier. That makes sense, so that's the Old Testament, the New Testament. So I was thinking about sonatas, and I've talked a lot about sonata form, but I've never really delved into it in a lot of detail. So I wanted to really kind of, I've alluded to things, and A themes and B themes and development sections, and how they kind of represents a kind of little play that's going on, a little drama. But I haven't really been so specific, so I thought I would take a movement of a sonata, which I find in a curious way relates to the Waldstein, which is because that I did before, because this is in C major, and it's something that can, and although this is much earlier and much more, in a way, more straightforward in structure. But sonata form is something that developed over time. A lot of symphonies are composed in sonata form, so the structure goes beyond just the use as an actual sonata, and it's gone to a lot of other. But sonata form, in a sense, is a little play. It has characters that relate, and there are certain kind of rules that tend to come back. Now, there are, of course, variations in every structure and every form, and Beethoven himself was constantly pushing this structure and expanding it and changing it and pushing it in past the limits that it had known before with people like Mozart and Haydn. But and the sonata form has several different themes. A sonata. So normally there's an A theme or an A theme group. In this sonata, it's a very frightening one because it starts out with double thirds. The pianist, we used to sing, I'm gonna have a nervous breakdown. Anyway, so because it was a hard way to start a sonata. Like that's bad, right? So that's the first motive or theme, the A. And it goes on, there's more to it. Little bass, there. That would be the first A theme. And there's a second A theme, which is much more arpeggiated and more kind of dramatic and virtuosic. We get that into a transition. And suddenly you notice that we're in the dominant key. It's a very important sonata because the play between the tonic and the dominant, or the fifth, is a very, very important relationship in sonatas. Usually what happens at this point is the theme comes in a different key. In this case, I call this a transition theme. And because we haven't really gotten to the main B theme yet. But what's interesting is that these themes have, in a certain sense, and this is an antiquated way of thinking, and certainly not a feminist way of thinking, but in the old days, they tended to think of the more aggressive, more dominant themes as kind of the masculine themes, and the more lyrical or beautiful themes, the feminine themes, just the way that they thought about the sexes in those days. Nowadays, I think everybody can do any kind of thing. But using that paradigm, the transition has more of a B quality, more of a lyrical legato volume. That's in the dominant minor, and then another key. Now this is all transitory. This is transition to the actual main group, and then he gives us an eighth kind of transition, a much more aggressive. And with this little figure, we get to what I would call the B theme proper, and it's a duet. So if that's in the female range, then in the male range, through the arrow. So here. So he creates a B theme that has a sense of the duet. Now, if we were going to tell this as a little story, this might be, I love you, I love you, I love you. Right? And furthermore, you know, I'm going to carry you off someday, perhaps. Don't forget about my father. He doesn't like musicians. And then, but then the answer in the A transition, this transition that leaves this theme is like, hell with your father, right? We're in love, right? We'll find our way. And then the duet, the love duet. And now he leads, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. And a transition, a retransition, which has, interestingly, 4 parts, a big transition. You see how this relates to the eighth theme? Let's relate to this. So it comes from the second A theme, but it's a trend. And then a new idea. It sounds very final in that big masculine A theme kind of way with a little B transition. Right? And then a nice big little coda to this beginning section, which altogether is the exposition. In other words, it's telling you all the characters and themes. In the dominant, you remember we're in this key at the beginning. Now we have a rock in the dominant. So if the A theme, or the masculine character of the little drama, has the tonic, the main key, the dominant is normally the feminine, or the different keys, so they oppose each other. There's something. Then we get to something he calls the development section. And the development section opens with a that little beat transition. And then we get something completely different. Now we're into the development section. And the development section is kind of like when it all goes into the Cuisinart and you push the button. All these themes get blended together, used in different ways. Beethoven, in this, introduces a new kind of improvisatory theme. In a way, it sounds like he's basically on chord structure, and in a completely different key than we've had. We're suddenly in B flat, and in the diminished scale, and F minor, and D flat, F sharp minor, the farthest possible key away from C major. So So he's arrived here, and then back to D major, and then we have a false recapitulation. We're going to hear this theme again, but it's in the wrong key. It's in D major. So it's not really the. Then you get this another development theme, which he does kind of, but it. Taking us through several keys, okay? Then at the end, there is this hopping octave that you heard, right? So you get and an echo. So they're doing the same hop of that octave. And that becomes kind of the big theme of the transition at the end, which we end. And bringing back a lot of the elements of the theme, and then we get back to the recapitulation, right? And slight variations in the way that the themes develop, but eventually when we get to that theme, we get to now what happens is that I told you that first transition theme, which was here, the minor one, which I said was What About My Father. Now it's still in minor, but in his minor, not her minor, not G minor, but it arrives in C minor. So something has resolved. Even though she's maintained her character, she's coming along his way a little bit here. And in a good sonata, in a sense, the themes resolve to each other. The B theme usually resolves to the key and comes down to the key of the A theme, but the A theme takes on some of the quality and the softness and the romanticism of the B theme. So there's, in a sense, these two characters seeing more eye to eye. And then at the end, there's a coda. And the coda brings back several of the themes, and in this case, the coda starts with what sounds like a third a recapitulation of the theme, but it's not. It begins the coda, and then there's a thing. So I'm going to play this, but I want you to kind of hear this little play going on. This A theme set, and the other more aggressive theme. And these quick moving sixteenths, and then the transition, her theme, and his answer, which leads us to that fantastic duet. And transitioning out of that with him again, and these big octave jumps, and then her little coy answer at the end, which leads to the development section. And then that fantastic development section, and then the way the sonata comes back. So I dare you to kind of try to grab onto these themes, as would have been the way that people listened in the early 1800s, because they weren't used to, I think, as much music coming at them as we have nowadays with radio and television and recordings. And so music was done live, and it's very special. There were no recordings. So I think the mind, in a certain sense, grasped these and analyzed in a different way than we often do. So we often kind of just let the music wash over us, which is quite wonderful, and I'm sure they did as well. But there was an intellectual yearning or interest, an intellectual curiosity about how these pieces were put together. So people listened, I think, with slightly different ears, with these ears for the play and for the characters. So I challenge you or ask you to take this little sonata, or it's not a big sonata really, but take the sonata and listen to it in terms of those characters and themes, and see when you hear them come back, how they relate to each other. And this is a big sonata form. And it's the first movement of the Opus 2, number 3, sonata of B. 5 pieces to be public system play.
Janas, nice gentleman.
I don't know if we know a little more about Sonatas Horn, but I hope that was informative.
Stick around for the second set. We're going to take a 15-minute break.